on a planet called Ondawara. The last of the great beasts died 3 months ago. There was no roaring beast on the horizon. There was no army. There was a mountain, and 40 kilometers beneath it, a chamber. Inside that chamber lay a hexapedal organism, the length of 2 city blocks. A low, terraced, mineral-plated body that looked more like geology than biology. The Ondawarat called it the Oro Wanekera. In their language it meant, roughly, the Oro that ends the cycle. They tracked it with a planet-spanning array of listening stations. They drilled 3 shafts down to its chamber, fed nuclear-tipped ordnance down each one, and 20 minutes later declared the beasts extinct. The celebrations lasted 3 months. In every city on all 3 continents, elders read the old vow aloud. For the first time in 25,000 years of recorded history, they added a new line. The work of the ancestors is complete. 3 weeks in, a junior astronomer filed a routine bulletin about an unusual haze in the upper atmosphere. Nobody read it. They were exactly on schedule for their own doom, and they did not know. To understand what the Ondawarat had done, you have to understand what lived beneath their feet. Ondawara is, in most respects, an ordinary terrestrial planet. 2 continents, weather, seasons, forests, rain. A humanoid species, cities of mineral brick, nuclear power. The wrongness of Ondawara is not on its surface, it is under it. When the planet formed 4.5 billion years ago, its birth cloud was unusually enriched with heavy radioactive elements. Uranium, thorium, the debris of a nearby dying star. Those elements settled into stratified reservoirs 20 to 60 kilometers down. For the entire history of the planet, those reservoirs have been warm, chemically strange, and quietly glowing with radiation strong enough to sterilize anything from the surface within minutes. Life adapted to it anyway. Deep in the crust, a lineage of organisms evolved that ran their whole metabolism on radiation itself. Living batteries, charging in the dark, storing enough energy in phosphate reserves to sleep for 25,000 years at a stretch. They grew large. They came in 5 kinds. The Ondawarat had never understood them as a family. They had understood them as 5 separate enemies. The largest was the mesa form, the Oro, 60 to 120 meters long, 6 columnar leg pillars the size of grain silos, a body wider than tall, a piece of moving geology that could level a farming town by walking across it. On the highland plateaus stood the cathedral form, the Wara. This was not an animal that walked, a hilltop with a forest of mineral spires growing out of it, reaching 200 meters into the lower atmosphere. It stood, and it caught the sky, and it lasted. Along the coasts wandered the wading form, the Hala, flat as a shelf of beach on 8 stubby legs, its wide back skimming particulate off the surface of the sea itself. Beneath the soil, in the shallow subsurface, moved the burrowing form, the Umatir, a horizontal mineral column pushing itself forward inches at a time through soft ground and aquifer. When it surfaced, it broke the plain as a long, low ridge, and then descended again. And everywhere else, in ordinary countryside and near ordinary towns, walked the bolder form, the ovu, 10 meters long, 4 short legs, a standing stone that had decided to amble across the pasture. This was the one an ordinary Ondawaran might see once in her life. None of them had a head, none had eyes, none had a mouth, none had ever hunted anything. When they surfaced, they walked. When they were done walking, they went back down and slept. The Ondawarat had a single word for all 5. The Ovumakit, the roof breakers, the coming and shattering ones. The word contained the whole civilization's understanding of what the family did. It did not contain what the family was for. The Ondawarat believed, and had believed, for as long as they had written anything down, that the sole moral task of their species was to end the Ovumakit. 25,000 years earlier, the survivors of the previous emergence had come out of their river valleys and made a vow to their descendants. They called it the Wanekiro. The vow was simple. The ancestors survived. You must do more than survive. Before they come back, end them. Every Ondawaran child, for 25,000 years, was taught the vow before they were taught to read. The vow shaped everything. It shaped the metallurgy, the chemistry, the industry. Every leap in Ondawaran technology was measured against one problem: stone, bronze, iron powder, gunpowder, fission, orbit. Every advance was scaled against the beasts. Chemistry advanced because chemistry could kill them faster. Industry advanced because industry could build more ordnance. Across the extermination era, the civilization built 5 separate victory narratives, one for each kind of beast, each celebrated as a triumph in its own generation. In the 22nd millennium, a fission-scale salvo collapsed the last apex hala. The Hala Utarumira, 48 meters long, 3 million years old. Into the estuary it had wandered up. The commander was named the Shore Restorer. On every anniversary since, coastal communities have lit chains of fires from headland to headland. 2,500 years later, an orbital thermobaric strike killed the last of the cathedral form Wara, the Wara Nuwana, whose crystalline crown at 224 meters was the tallest ever measured on the planet. The engineers who cracked it aimed the strike between 2 ventral ridges of the base to breach it from below before the crown could dissipate the heat. The polished stub of Wara Nuwana's tallest spire is still a pilgrimage site. A century and a half later, the planetary seismic array caught a burrowing form at depth. Engineers pre-drilled a nuclear intercept shaft ahead of its projected path, the Umatir Suruwana, passing through it 12 kilometers beneath the northern plains. The array's operators were collectively named the long listeners of the cycle. The monument at the strike site is a plaza built into the floor of the intercept shaft. Visitors ride slow lifts down and stand in it in silence. The Ovu had been the everywhere form. Their global population chart descended in tidy 10-fold steps. 500 at year 20,000, 90 at 23, 12 at 24, 1 at 24,928. That last one, the Ovu Omalira, was tracked across the central plateau for 3 weeks and killed by an orbital kinetic strike. There was no ordnance in it. It was, essentially, a rock dropped from space. The team who did it were the last fellas. And finally, this year, the Halawanekira, for the last of the giants, the Orowanekira, buried 3 months ago in the ruin of its own chamber. 5 kills, 5 ceremonies, 5 titles handed out across 19,000 years. In the Ondawarat's minds, 5 separate wars, each one on its own terms. What they had not done, what they had never had any framework for doing, was ask whether the 5 enemies had been fighting something else. 11 years before the Orowanekira died, a graduate student in the paleontological priesthood was working through a routine analysis of the fossil record. The record was well known. Every 25,000 years, the strata carried a thin, dark lamina, 6 to 18 centimeters thick, laid down in the same interval as the beast emergences and the mass die-offs that followed them. The mainstream teaching was straightforward. When the beasts emerged, they walked through the biosphere, and species with certain heavy metals in their tissues took the worst of the damage. Her name in the priesthood rolls is Halawana Ovumati. She noticed something the story did not explain. The extinctions were selective for those metal-heavy species, but they were selective in the same way everywhere. In coastal biomes, where no mesa form had ever walked, in polar tundras nowhere near a cathedral form, in shallow seas the wading form did not enter. If the beasts had caused it, the pattern should have concentrated where the beasts had been. It did not concentrate anywhere. It was global, and it was chemically precise. It killed the same metals in the same order across the whole planet, as if something were stripping metals out of living tissue from the top down. She wrote up the finding. Her advisor told her gently that the interpretation was speculative and would not survive peer review. She revised. He told her, less gently, to focus on more important things. She filed the paper in the departmental archive, where it sat, unread, for 11 years. She had described correctly the fingerprint of something alive falling from the sky and feeding on the biosphere. She had assumed, because everyone assumed, that it fell during the beast years because the beasts brought it. She had the direction of causation exactly backwards. The beasts came because it fell. The astronomer who filed the bulletin 20 days before the story's present did not think of it as a discovery. She thought of it as bookkeeping. Her name in the Kirola astronomer's logs is Munawara Kirolat. Her group had been tracking a diffuse cool aerosol drifting through the local galactic neighborhood for 20 years. 20 days before the story's present, her instruments picked up the same signature, unmistakably, in Ondawara's own upper atmosphere. It was too high, too diffuse, too cold to be volcanic dust. She filed a routine bulletin. She did not connect it to anything else. She did not read the paleontological priesthood's journals. Almost nobody did. 3 weeks later, a biologist in a southern museum, Ondawara Rumati, was cataloguing the mineral crusts on the outer plates of long-dead beast corpses in the civilization's collections. She ran a routine compositional scan. What came back was silicate magnesium-iron crystalline salts, laid down in the outer layers of every corpse she checked, going back 4,000 years. Then she looked at the crystalline salts under higher magnification and stopped moving. The encrustations were not chemistry. They had structure, six-fold radial symmetry, fine crystalline fringe arms broken off at the edges. Something like a body wall, and inside it, something like the ghost of an internal chamber. Whatever the beast's outer plates had accumulated across the centuries, it was not mineral dust. It was the crushed and burnt remains of individual living organisms, thousands of them per gram, killed and calcified in place. She wrote a short note to a colleague. The beasts didn't just eat this. They killed it. The colleague wrote back to say this could not be right. The beasts had no mouths, no weapons, no combat behavior of any kind. He was correct on the facts. He did not, in the same letter, ask the next question. What about the beasts, then, was killing these things? Because in the entire 25,000-year archive of Ondawaran thought, no one had ever asked it. There had never been a reason to. The letter has since been recovered. It is dated 4 days before the sky changed for the last time. The next morning, the layer descended. It arrived first as a faint teal shimmer high in the pale ochre sky over the equatorial continents. A wrongness. Then undeniable wrongness. Within a week, crop biologists in 3 regions reported metal-heavy grains failing en masse. Coastal mollusks failed next. Under the microscope, the failing tissues showed the same 6-fold microbodies attached to the plant capillary walls, pulling iron out of blood pigments, magnesium out of chlorophyll analogues, zinc out of enzyme cores, and growing. The paleontological priesthood pulled Halawana Ovumati's paper out of the archive. They read it aloud in the central rotunda on a grey morning 3 weeks after the sky changed. The reading finished in silence. Someone in the room ran the fossil layer counts against the Kirola astronomer's drift record. The alignment was exact, as if the 2 records had been the same measurement all along, made in different rooms of the same building for 2 centuries, and never put next to each other. Here is the mechanism, plainly. Every beast body, of every one of the 5 types, had been a chronic radiation source. Their metabolism ran on radiation. Their tissues were saturated with it from birth. They walked around continuously, irradiating the ground and the atmosphere for 100 meters around them, at doses that were ordinary metabolic input to themselves, and lethally sterilizing to anything with a thin silicate metal membrane and a fragile infostrand. The falling invader was fragile. Its bodies were microns thick. Its infostrand was as radiation vulnerable as any Earth-analog carbon-water organism's DNA. Wherever a beast had walked or waded or burrowed or stood, the invader died on contact. The cathedral form sterilized the upper atmosphere. The mesa form swept the lower atmosphere. The wading form covered the atmosphere-ocean boundary. The burrower sterilized the soil and aquifer. The boulder form held the baseline everywhere else. Together, they had killed every fragment of the invader before it could feed, aggregate, or reproduce. That is why the horizons under full protection took out 5 to 12%, and the horizons before them took out 8 in 10. The beasts had never been beasts. The beasts had been the fence, and the fence had never fought anything. The fence had simply been there, radioactive, walking around, and the thing on the other side had died the moment it touched the fence. The civilization had spent 25,000 years, 5 generations of ordnance, and every gram of institutional will it had ever possessed, taking the fence down. Something on the other side had been arriving on a 25,000-year clock since long before the first ancestor had lit the first fire, and it had begun to arrive again exactly on schedule. The Ondawarat had killed the last of what was keeping them alive 3 months before it was needed most. The Nawaruma convened in emergency session 10 days after the fossil record was re-read aloud. There was, formally, no such thing as an emergency. The Nawaruma had a mandate for anymore. Its charter had been to end the beasts, and the beasts had ended. The council met anyway. The options were read into the record, as if a technical brief. Captive breeding of the remaining sentinels, about 50 small boulder form in wildlife reserves, required decades to reach maturity and generations to reach apex scale. Chemical countermeasures, nothing in the civilization's chemistry, touched the invader. Fission-scale weapons in the atmosphere would irradiate a local zone and accelerate dispersion of the rest. Orbital interception. There was no target to intercept. Retreat underground. The biosphere collapse above would reach the deep valleys within decades. There were no options. There were only shapes of options. The one weapon they had ever had against this enemy was the Kaunatura. They had dismantled it. 2 days after the emergency session closed, the Kirola astronomers filed a second bulletin. This one was read. Their instruments had picked up a single coherent atmospheric mass anomaly, drifting 70 kilometers up. It was 200 meters across. It was hollow. It had 6-fold radial symmetry visible in the density profile. And it was growing. The rate of growth was consistent with countless smaller feeding aggregates on the surface below, bud-releasing new individuals upward, which then recondensed at high altitude and merged into a single lattice. The paleontological priesthood checked the fossil record for a precedent. There was none. In every previous cycle, no aggregate had ever survived the radiation dose long enough to condense into a coherent apex mass at all. This one had. It was a first-time thing. Nothing had ever stopped it, because nothing had ever needed to. The paleontological priesthood named it that same afternoon. In their own language, they called it the Onkalira Iruwana, the Onkalira that blooms rooted, the invader that has begun to gather itself. The Kirola astronomers ran the projections into the evening. Within 3 years, 1 kilometer across. Within 20, 5. Within 50, 20 kilometers of connected reef feeding on the continents. Within 200, at the end of the current window, 40 kilometers and more. A single structure at extinction levels the fossil record only preserved from before the beasts had covered the biosphere. Whether any of the projection is final could not be said. It was the first time anyone would ever have seen what came next. The particulate is falling. The apex mass is growing. The Ondawarat never named the thing they were seeing. In the far future archives, it is known by a different name, the World Ender. They only ever saw the first 200 meters of it.